Get to the Movies.
Hey all, it's Adam from Get to the Movies, here again for another weekend wrap-up, where I'll take a look at the things that I've watched over the last week. To kick things off, I started with another film in my Bondtober event, where I'm watching every single James Bond movie in preparation for the Australian release of No Time to Die on November 11th. So, this week, I kicked off with the Roger Moore entries, and first up was Live and Let Die. My review's already on Instagram, but let's say I'm not a huge fan of this one. 5.5 out of 10. Roger Moore is my least favourite Bond. I find him ridiculously cheesy, and although I think as a person Roger Moore is great, his Bond doesn't do anything for me at all. Because it centres on drug dealers as well, the film just feels a little bit small in comparison to the pretty out there exploits that you saw in some of Connery's films. So this one leaves a little bit to be desired. So not the greatest entry and not a great way to start things off with Roger Moore's entries. The good news was that on Monday night, cinemas opened in Australia and I got to visit the cinema, and my first film that I got to see on return to the cinema was James Gunn's The Suicide Squad. So that one's finally been released in Australia for all of us to see, and I loved it. It's not perfect, but it's exactly what you'd expect from James Gunn. It's irreverent, it's gory, and it's a hell of a good time. Idris Elba's good as always, though it's pretty clear that the role was written for Will Smith's Deadshot character, but that's alright, it translates okay, and there are even a few moments where it looks pretty obvious that they're winking at the fact that they've essentially replaced Will Smith's character. Margot Robbie is excellent, and she gets to have a really kick-ass fight scene in the film. The highlight for me, though, is David Dastmalchian. He is absolutely exceptional as Polka Dot Man, and a character who you'd think would be absolutely ludicrous and totally not the star of the show, ends up stealing it every step of the way. He's one of those character actors that shows up in a million films, but nobody ever knows his name. Well, I won't ever forget it. He's fantastic in it. John Cena's great as well, and obviously if you've been watching the DC fandom event that's been on over the last 24 hours, we got a sneak peek at the spin-off series for his character. Tuesday night, seeing as I'd been to the cinemas once, I figured why not go again, and this time I took the family for their first visit back post-lockdown, and I saw ShangChi and The Legend of the Ten Rings, so Marvel's latest entry. That one was pretty entertaining, 7 out of 10 for me, though it's pretty clear that it sticks fairly close to the Marvel formula, even though trying something new with some representation from Asia. There were some really excellent moments in it, 2 fight scenes in particular. Obviously the bus fight scene is amazing, the choreography's great in that one, but there's also a fight scene in a forest, and that one has some really beautiful choreography, and along with the visuals in it, just makes for a really impressive scene. Unfortunately, they both come fairly early on in the film. The cast is solid. Michelle Yeoh is awesome as always. Awkwafina bugged me a little bit. Not a huge fan of her in this role, but somebody who stood out for me was Tony Leung. He was fantastic and easily the highlight of the film. And of course, we also get Ben Kingsley show up. He's the comic relief this time again, just like he was in the second half of Iron Man 3, and he adds some much needed levity to the film. So, moving on, after going to the cinema 2 days in a row, I figured I'd better get back to my Bondtober event, and I continued on with Roger Moore's entries. This time, The Man with the Golden Gun. This is by far one of the weakest entries for me in the Bond genre as a whole, and also with Roger Moore's tenure. Although Christopher Lee is in the film and is absolutely amazing as always, there's not a whole lot to like about this one. It really squanders the cast that it has and the locations that it visits, and it just feels flat overall. Not one of the finest entries at all. So 5 out of 10 for that one. Continuing on, I thought, seeing as though Roger Moore isn't somebody I'm a huge fan of when it comes to his Bond, I continued on that one pretty quick smart and moved on to The Spy Who Loved Me. This one is by far one of my favourite Roger Moore entries. It takes things a little bit more seriously, and when I say a little bit, I mean a little bit. He's still pretty camp and cheesy in this film, but there are several sequences where the drama takes hold instead, and it works almost as well as Lazenby's and Connery's Bond when Connery is at his weakest. And so this one gets a 6.5 out of 10 for me. It's quite close to some of the weaker Connery entries, and in particular I really like the sequence in Egypt. The cinematography there, the lighting, particularly at night, it just sets a great mood, and by far Roger Moore's best film for me. On Friday night I wrapped up Star Trek Lower Decks Season 2 on Amazon Prime. So the season finale aired, and I've got to say, I really enjoyed this season. 7.5 out of 10 for me. Lower Decks is a strange beast. As a Star Trek fan, ever since I was a kid, it's probably the least reverent of all the series to Gene Roddenberry's ideals in terms of seriousness, but it still takes the themes that he had running through his series very seriously, even though the characters are often ridiculous and so are the settings. There's an enormous amount of fan service, so if you're a fan like me, Easter eggs abound galore in it. And Mike McMahon's really tapped into both the comedy and paying fan service to longtime fans like myself. One of the highlights, though, this season easily is Chris Westlake's score. For an animated series, the fact that there's an orchestral score really highlights things in terms of the production quality. He pays homage to Jerry Goldsmith and James Horner, particularly their scores of some of the Star Trek films, and it really helps tie everything in, along with the sound effects and the look of the series. It really makes it feel like a Next Generation counterpart. So even though it's absolutely ridiculous, you can totally take it seriously. And I wouldn't be remiss if somebody like Chris Westlake actually did the scores for other Trek series, because I think he really knows how to tap into some of that nostalgia and capture the spirit of Star Trek. And last night, I revisited Boss Level. So this one I got to see in the cinema in March and had a great time with it. Lots of fun. Look, I love action comedies as much as anybody else, and when there's a time travel element as well, that's just fine by me. If you've seen the film Shoot 'Em Up, you've probably got yourself a bit of an idea of what you're in for in terms of ridiculously over-the-top action and gore, with quite a bit of comedy as well, and that really works well. Frank Grillo, although you wouldn't normally pick him as a leading man, does really well in this role. Obviously, he does the action scenes particularly well. But the fact that they wisely chose his son to play his son in the film means that he's got a fatherly bond there, so it's not much of a stretch for him and doesn't demand things that he might not be able to deliver. So it works pretty well. Mel Gibson does just fine as the villain. He's fantastic at delivering some of the witty dialogue, and he's got that threatening element down, which, if you've seen some of the comments he's made in real life, maybe that's not too far of a stretch. But the fact is, on screen, he's spot on for what's expected of him. So that was last night's watch, and that gets a 7.5 out of 10 for me. So that's the week in review. I've also been watching The West Wing Season 5. That has a slight dip in quality. Obviously, after Aaron Sorkin left, things take a step down, but I'm still working my way through that one, and there are several episodes during that season that are still quite good, and several that are at the quality level of Aaron Sorkin's work. My review will come through for that one once I've finished off the season, and I've started in on Studio 60 on the Sunset Strip as well. So no planned theatre visits this week, so I'll be sticking more into the Bondtober event and hoping to get through the rest of those before the month's out. So I'll catch you next week for another update. See you then.